Welcome to the St. Matthew's Episcopal Church podcast, coming to you from Northern Virginia. We're so glad you're here. Today, we hope our message inspires you to better know and share God's love. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and join our weekly newsletter, The Friday Flash, to stay updated on all of our events and services. Let's dive in.
Well, I'm counting my blessings this morning, and I see well over 100 of them here today. And at least one more when we leave here with the beignets we have for you afterwards. So they're going to be really good. Hey, I am just super excited you're here. A, because you're here, and I love seeing you. But B, we launch a new sermon series today. And this one is called Beyond Belief. And I think in what we're going to talk about today, you are going to see in a surprising way what a difference belief makes. How very practical belief is. How important it is we get it right. And what a frankly unbelievable difference it makes when we do. We're going to talk about it in the context of hope. Because here's the thing I know about life. If you're going to get life right, you're going to need to learn how to deal with suffering. And to be able to deal with suffering, you have to learn to hope. I mean, right? Suffering is an inevitable part of life. But the only healthy way through suffering is through hope. And so, as we think about that, you may be familiar with a concept called learned helplessness. Yeah, I know. I feel like that some days too, believe me. It's okay. It'll get better. Maybe. All right, learned helplessness. Who knows what learned... You probably know what learned helplessness is. That was the idea that when a person feels like they have no control over negative circumstances, then they just get discouraged and passive and feel like life is hopeless. So if it's just a barrage of negative circumstances over which a person has no control, they just feel like life's beating them and they get discouraged and give up. What's super interesting is that in the last couple years, there are now a couple of experiments that have been done so that in the widely held opinion in the scientific community, learned helplessness has officially been debunked, right? People actually don't think that is a thing anymore, because what they say is we actually start out helpless, right? That's the default setting. What we have to learn is not how to be helpless. What we have to learn is how to hope. Learning to hope, that's pushing against our nature. Learning to hope, that's what doesn't come naturally for human beings. Learning to hope, that's something we have to cultivate, practice, and grow. And that brings us to the reading from 1 Peter today. In an Episcopal church, and this is an Episcopal church, in any given Sunday we actually have 4 readings: an Old Testament reading, a Psalm, a New Testament reading, and a Gospel. At this service, we only read the Gospel as a way of keeping us focused. But today, I felt like we know the story of Thomas pretty well, and we probably haven't talked about 1 Peter maybe ever, so we'll talk about that today. And in 1 Peter, Peter is writing to a group of people who are suffering. We're told they're going through various trials, and so they're living a life very much like yours. There's occasions in that life that are causing them grief and sorrow, just like there are occasions in your life, circumstances, events, limitations, whatever, that cause us grief and sorrow. And in the midst of those that grief and sorrow, Paul is giving them a reason to hope. And he says, and if you want to just pull out your bulletin insert, if you'll hand me a bulletin insert, please. Thank you. It's the one on the inside, 1 Peter 1, 3-9. Believe it or not, we also have Bibles in the pew, and sometimes we'd actually walk through the Bibles too, and that's kind of a cool thing to do every now and then also. But it says, "Blessed be the Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. By His great mercy, He has given us a new birth into a living hope. Now, the literal translation there would be, He's caused us to be born again. But the Episcopal Church doesn't really like that word born again, so they tend to translate it. I'm joking a little bit. We tend to be a little bit more, born again we tend to see as for other types of people, right? Not so much but that word is in there. Jesus used it, John used it, Peter used it. It's a fundamental concept of the New Testament. There tend to be, well, I was going to say 2 approaches, but after talking with Josh this morning, I've amended it to 3 approaches to being born again. The one is that we're born again in baptism. And I'd expect that many of you, if you consider yourself born again, you would consider that it was baptism that you were born again. For some of us who come from slightly different traditions, such as myself, I have a date that I remember where I made a formal commitment to Jesus Christ, which I've then lived out my life ever since, May 18th, 1973. I would consider that the date on which I was born again. Josh said that it's a little bit like falling in love with your wife. And I think his wife, yes, okay, she's still here, so good, yes, all right. Yeah, so he said it's not so much that you point to a specific date, it's that I love her more every day, which I thought was a fantastic answer. It's not that we looked at a particular point where we were born again or that I fell in love, but it's that every day I love my wife more. Every day I love the Lord more. So it's an ongoing process, and to try and pinpoint it to any given point sort of betrays and undercuts that process. However you understand it, when we think of ourselves as being born again, as being introduced in some reality beyond simply life in the natural world, what we're saying is that we have faith in God, that we have faith in a being who is able to act on our behalf to draw us into a relationship with Himself. And on the basis of that belief in the God who acts, the basis of that belief of a God who wants to have a relationship with us, we have hope that God who has already acted in our being born again, our born again is an expression of that faith. The ultimate outworking of that faith is our salvation. So in being born again, we're given a living hope that as God has acted in this moment where we're born again, however we understand that, and you can understand that as you will, that it's given us this living hope that's different from a worldly hope that God will bring us to the fullness of God's salvation. And Peter will go on to describe that work, that hope, in 3 different ways. You'll see that there. He says that that we're given an inheritance that's imperishable. Imperishable simply means that it's unable to be ravaged by invading armies. And literally in that day, they were literally thinking of invading armies, but we've never had an invading army in this country, so we probably don't go to that. But we could think of the invading armies of our mind that would steal our hope. There's all kinds of forces in our own minds, at least in my mind, I expect in yours too, that would steal your hope. And so what Peter is saying is this hope that God gives us, that was given to us in being given new birth, so that we have hope for God's salvation, that delivers us from the invading armies of our mind which would steal and destroy our hope. He says it's undefiled, which means it's unpolluted, which means its vigor, its health, its life-giving properties are undiminished. They're still full and vital and robust. And it's unfading. It's not subject to circumstances or change. This is the living hope that we are given. And so what's being said here is this hope that's offered to us in our relationship with God and the promise of our salvation. Again, however you understand that, is it lifts us beyond which has sometimes been called provisional. And provisional just means limited or circumstantial. And the person who I think first coined this term was a guy by the name of Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl wrote a book, Man's Search for Meaning. He wrote it in 1946, if you can believe that. So it's 80 years old. And I mean, just last week I heard 2 foremost authorities in the world on a particular subject mentioning Viktor Frankl and saying how reading Man's Search for Meaning had changed their lives. So if you've never read that book, you need to read it. I mean, it's one I reread with some frequency. And I reread it for this. And one thing that he says is simply this. he says that the person who can't see the end of their provisional existence, and the provisional existence would just be things like our professional achievement, our fortunes or finances, our position in society, our health, things like that are limited, and they can be taken away from us. And that's precisely what suffering does. Suffering takes these things away from us. He even would include family in that, because in some forms of suffering, it's family that's taken away from us, right? And so what he says is this. He says the person who couldn't see beyond the end of their provisional existence, the things that can be taken away from us and which are taken away from us in suffering, was not able to aim at an ultimate goal in life, something that went beyond the provisional, something that was eternal, if you will. And he said that person, and he saw this in the POW concentration camps, that person ceased living for the future and they began to decay. That's an interesting thought. They ceased living for the future, having something beyond the provisional hopes that our world provides. They didn't have a living hope that transcended all that transcended ourselves, that was bigger than ourselves. They began to decay. And what he said was that when he came from the concentration camps and came back out into society, he saw that same decay in people who were living with provisional hopes, right? Circumstantial hopes, if you will. Very different than the hope that Peter is talking about. And so when Peter talks about our hopes being purified by gold, we'll go on and talk about this. What he's talking about is not, he's saying you're suffering various kinds of trials. He's saying these trials they're not God making your life miserable. But they are, what they're doing is they're separating what's gold from that which is not gold. In other words, separating what's provisional, that which isn't truly able to provide us hope, that which ultimately isn't able to truly save us, from that which gives us this eternal perspective, this transcendent perspective that gives us hope no matter what. And so then this becomes the promise in 1 Peter. And the idea is that we have this change, and this is something I only heard recently. Maybe you've heard this a long time ago, but this thought sort of blows my mind. And we're not going to talk about it much here today, but we will at some point, and I invite you to think about it with me. But it's the idea between the signal and the interpretation of that signal. The signal in our life is pain, right? That's a literal physiological thing. But suffering is our interpretation of pain. So one person can approach pain and it can make them absolutely miserable and beat them, and another person can take pain and put it in a context where it's ennobling, where it causes growth, where it helps them be who they want to be. And this is what Viktor Frankl says: when we can look beyond the provisional, then we have opportunities to see in all these things actually the means for spiritual growth and to become the people that we really want to be, that we feel like God is calling us to be. And so the idea is that when we're suffering, rather than saying, "Oh, poor little me, why, that instead of saying that, we'd say, "This is what it feels like to become the person God is calling me to be." Or if that's too much for you, "This is what it feels like to become the person I want to be." Or, "This is what it feels like to be getting stronger." You see, that's a very different statement. That's a very different belief than saying, "I'm suffering and I shouldn't suffer because life owes me more than that." Right? It's a healthy approach to suffering and allows suffering to ennoble us and grow us and mature us. Well, let me tell you one last story that I think pulls all this together. And this is a story about another experiment. This one was done in the 1950s by a guy. His name was Kurt Richter. Couldn't do this experiment today. It's another one of those deeply unethical experiments. But they learned some tremendous things through this experiment. And what the guy did was he went out and he got a whole bunch of wild rats. He tried a whole bunch of wild rats, which people didn't care much about then, and a lot of people, I guess, don't care much about now. And he wanted to see how long they could swim. Why, I'm not exactly certain. But he threw them in water, and then he went to time them how long they would swim. And it turned out they could swim about 15 minutes. They could swim about 15 minutes. And then, and he figured they'd swim a long time because he figured wild rats are robust, vigorous, strong, a powerful drive to survive. Then he put domesticated rats in water, and he figured these are the pansies of the rat world. They're coddled, and if wild rats can only last 15 minutes in the water, well then domesticated rats, what hope do they have? But turns out the domesticated rats swim for hours and hours and hours. Their performance just buries the wild rats. And he says, that's puzzling. What could the difference between these two be? And he postulates that what the domesticated rats had was this experience of somebody reaching in to help them. So their whole life long is some divine power, if you will, giving them food, giving them water, taking them out occasionally, loving on them, petting them, so on and so forth. And so when these rats are put in water, this same force that's been helping their whole life long, they don't see this. They don't see the water as being the be-all and the end-all. They think, okay, whatever's helped me in the past, it'll help me again. It's going to take me out of the water. I'll be okay. So they just get in the expectation that help's coming. They just kept swimming and swimming and swimming, waiting for that help to come. And sure enough, the help comes. And so he said, okay, well, if that's the difference, and the wild rats, they have no experience of that. They think it's only up to them, right? They've got to survive on their strength and their strength alone. Their willpower alone. It's how strong they are, how tough they are, how, it's them and them alone, the rat against the world. And it turns out they don't do so well that way. So he says, well, can we teach these wild rats how to have hope? Because his assertion is these rats don't have any hope. And so what he does now is he goes and catches a whole new crop of wild rats because the first ones are no longer around. And he throws them in the water. And at that point where they start to sink, he reaches in, takes them out, dries them off, brings out his little hair blower, warms them up, feeds them a little chocolate bar, pets them, and then puts them back in the water, right? And at that point where they're about to sink, he takes them out again, does the same thing, repeats this several times, and then he puts them back in the water. All right, these rats, the first batch of wild rats, they could swim for 15 minutes on their own. When he does this, how long do you think they swam? Now, you can figure I'm setting you up a little bit, right? You're expecting this to be a surprising answer. So it's going to have to be a quantity that surprises half an hour. That would be, they swam twice as long. What intervention, what could motivate you to double your performance just like that? I mean, right? What an incredible thing it would be to discover that, wouldn't it? 2x beyond your capability, current capability. If you're saying, okay, yeah, half hour, but, I expect this answer to be surprising, so I'm just going to go all out. I'm going to say they swam for a whole hour, 4 times what they originally did. And again, what could I ever find that would enable me to perform 4 times better than I currently perform? I'd be super interested in that, wouldn't you? I mean, what would do that? Well, what if I told you that they didn't just swim 60 minutes, right, 4 times? They swam 60 hours, 2.5 days, 240 times the original swim length. Now, if that doesn't, I know, right? If that's not surprising, I don't know what is. That's it. And what changed? Nothing physically changes. There's no physical change whatsoever. The only change is what's happening here based on their experience. That is the only change. And the person who most recently writes about this experiment is, and there have been a bunch of people who've written about it over the years, is a guy by the name of Nir Nayal. And when he concludes this, these are the words he uses, and I find them super interesting because Nir Nayal is not a person of faith himself. But he says the difference that occurred in the life of these rats was they tasted hope through salvation. Exact words. They tasted hope through salvation. And that's what Peter is saying to you. You have tasted hope through salvation. And so no matter what life throws at you, you can trust that God will carry you through. Now, if that's true for rats, by God's grace and with God's help, how much more true will that be for you and for me? Amen.
Thank you for listening. If you're in the Northern Virginia area, we invite you to join us for worship or any of our events. For directions, service times, and information about our online services, visit stmtts.org. That's stmtts.org. Until next time, go in peace and share God's love.